In this chapter, we're going to look at a few more basic user interface components that come with Kendo. We've already handled buttons in the last chapter, so now we'll see how to add different kinds of inputs to our forms, including sliders, drop-downs, and text areas. We'll also convert our detail page interface to use the tab layout, and we'll complete dashboard filtering requirement by adding a combo box for assignee selection. Just like we did in the last chapter, we're going to reference the documentation on the Kendo for jQuery website, so make sure you have that open and handy because we're going to be doing some exercises as well. And we're going to start off with inputs next.
In this lesson, we'll be working on the add item form since it has a few simple inputs we can transform. Here we are looking at the completed project. I'm going to head away from the dashboard page to the backlog page right here. And here is the add link. I'm going to tap on that. This brings up the add new item form. We want to convert all these fields to Kendo fields. So here in the final result, you'll see that it's completed. The first one is an input, the second one is a text area, and the third one is a drop-down list. Before you watch me show you how to do this, I'll invite you now to pause the video and try to convert the form inputs to Kendo inputs. If you take a look at the documentation, you'll see components like autocomplete and ComboBox. And also, if you scroll down a little bit more, you'll see the text box and text area. It's the text box and text area that we'll use to add to this form. This is the add form of the current working project where we want to change this title field and the description field to Kendo text box and Kendo text area respectively. Let's start with that. Let's head over to the code and in the source directory, open up page backlog and then the backlog HTML file. I usually like to collapse the navigation because that's just static content and we don't really need to interact with that. Scroll down to where you have the modal dialog, and that's right over here. This is the add modal dialog. And you want to find the input and the text area. So here is the input, and it's just a regular HTML input. And here is the text area. These are the two that we're going to convert to Kendo. Notice that I already have an ID here for the input, new item title, and for the text area, new item description. We're going to use these IDs to grab a hold of these DOM elements in our jQuery code. Let's head over to index, and first we need to import the components that we want to use. And I'm going to use the targeted import approach here, where I only import the ones that I do want to use. And that's going to be at progress, Kendo UI, JS, Kendo text box, and I'm going to copy this one. Let's go ahead and import Kendo.text area as well. And let's head down to the document ready event right over here. And let's just find some free space within that event. Right here is good. I'm going to go ahead and select by ID those two elements that I need. So one of them is new item title. Let's copy and paste that in here. And this one is going to be Kendo text box. And we need the other one, the description. Let's copy that. And I'll select that. And this one is going to be the Kendo text area. Now, with that simple change made, let's go take a look at our add form. I'm going to click on add here. And you'll see that we have some styling for this field, the Kendo styling for the text input and the text area. There is a little bit of an issue here, and that's because I had my Bootstrap classes on there. So I'm going to remove the Bootstrap classes since all we need really is the Kendo styling now in order to inherit that theme that we're applying. So I'm going to leave the Bootstrap class out of it and leave only the Kendo styling. And now you'll see that we have a nice Kendo text box here, and we have a nice Kendo text area. Now the text box and text area have other advantages to just plain input field and text area in HTML. For example, you can provide a floating label and you can take a look at the documentation on how to do that. We're actually going to add an option to our text area in order to increase the height of the text area. And that's going to take in an options object with the rows property. I'm going to set the rows to 3. And you'll see that in the result, we have now a few rows that we can type in our text area, and that's 3 rows. Now, we also want to stretch out the title field and the description field to take up the full width of the form. And we can do that just with HTML. So let's head over to our input here, and I'm going to add an inline style here. You can do this either with an inline style or with your own custom class. And I'm going to add the style of width equals 100% to both the input and the text area. Let's take a look. And there we go. We're going to come back in the next lesson and take care of some drop downs. But before we do that, I'd like you to try and style this one right here on this form as a Kendo drop-down list. If you did the final exercise in the last lesson, then you should have already added the drop-down list to the add item form. Just to show you what that looks like, we can tap on add here. We have these two Kendoized components here at the top. These are the text inputs. And we have this drop-down list, which has the Kendo styling as well. Don't worry, if you haven't done this yet, we'll come back to it in a second. We're going to switch over to the details page. So I'm going to tap on one of these items to go to the details page. We have plenty of components to turn into Kendo components here. So the details page is made up of the page itself. And for every one of these screens, we have their own model and their own file that controls all the UI components and has the jQuery code. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go to the code for a second here. And we're going to open this page detail folder. Here we have the detail HTML. This is the main HTML file that has all our markup as well as the templates for each one of the screens. And when these screen buttons are tapped, it's going to switch between the screens and populate the screen container divs right here. This is all already set up for you, so you don't need to worry about this. The screens themselves live in the screens folder. We have the details screen, the tasks screen, and the chit chat screen. And each one of these has their own models associated with them that has the data. So our main details form here lives on the details screen. So let's go over there. I'm going to pop open the details screen right here. But let's not forget to also add our styling here in an index for the details. So I'm going to go up here and remove these two lines, the Bootstrap CSS and the Global App CSS, and replace it with our import. This is something we've already done in the previous lesson as well. There's our style imports. This way, we don't have to worry about styling anymore here. And these styles will apply to the details page, so it'll automatically apply to all the screens that live on that page as well. All right, we don't need this index anymore. Let's head over to the details screen and work here. Here's your opportunity to do another exercise. Go ahead and convert this status dropdown, which is now just an HTML select, to a Kendo dropdown list. If we take a look at the documentation, we have this drop-down list. Let's take a look at that. Here is the overview for it, along with some examples. Now, the drop-down list is a pretty extensive component. It has virtualization. It has server filtering, so you can trigger the server loads for the data itself. You can set it up as cascading drop-down list. We're going to use a very simple implementation of this, where we're binding just to basic strings. And then later on in this chapter, you'll see a combo box where we're binding to objects. And the combo box binding and the drop-down list binding work pretty much the same way. So you'll see examples of both simple string array binding and object binding. All right, so for your exercise, I recommend you start with status because that's going to be the simplest one to implement. It doesn't have any templates, so go ahead and try that out. Okay, hopefully you've tried that and you're back. Let's do this together now. I'm going to go to the code. And here I'm going to import just the Kendo drop-down list. Remember, we're importing only what we need now. So that's coming from progress, Kendo UI, JS, and then Kendo drop-down list. Once we have that imported, now we can start using the Kendo drop-down list. Let's take a look at the details screen template so we know what we need to change. I'm going to head down here. This is the modal dialog for the assignees. I can temporarily collapse that. Here's the details template. This is what has our details form. As you can see, we have the title here with the input, the text area, item type, and status. These are the selects now. So here's the select for the status. We're going to start with this one because it's the simplest one. This is already being populated by our details screen file. So we need to find where we're doing that. And we're populating it by using the cell status ID. So let's go here to details screen. And this is just standard jQuery code here. Let's find the cell status right here. So we're selecting the cell status select by its ID. And then we're iterating through the statuses provider, which is just a string array. I'll show you that in a second. And we're appending the options to the select element. So let's take a look at statuses provider. This is in the details screen model now. And statuses provider is actually this constant that we've declared in the core of the application. I'm going to navigate there. And as you can see, this is just an array that exposes each one of the statuses as strings. I'm going to close these. Okay, so that's working as it is, and that's working fine. How do we convert this to a Kendo drop-down list now? Well, I'm going to comment out this entire section for statuses. And instead, we're going to write some code that's related to Kendo UI, which is going to be significantly different here. But I want to keep this around because I want to copy out the statuses provider, which is the data field. So we're going to need that. Let's start down here. And in order to convert this select into a Kendo dropdown list, all we need to do is just select it using standard jQuery syntax. And then I'm going to call the Kendo dropdown list function on it. Now this is enough to make it a Kendo dropdown list, but it's not going to have any data yet. You can use a standard select in the HTML if it already has options. If you call this function Kendo dropdown list, it'll automatically convert the HTML select to a Kendo dropdown list. But because we're populating it dynamically, that's not going to work. So we're going to need some options here. Now I'm going to be more explicit about this. So instead of just passing in an object here, I'm going to create the options separately. So I'm going to create a constant here called DDL for dropdown list, status options. The one we really want is this data source option. So here we're going to point it to the array of statuses called statuses provider. I'm just going to copy it right out of here and paste it here. Great. And now I'm going to pass these options right here into our dropdown list function. Let's take a look. Okay, so you can see that status now has a Kendo dropdown list styled like Kendo, and we're able to select all these different items here, which are being served by the statuses provider. However, nothing's being saved, right? So if I refresh the page, you can see that the status reverts back to what it was. So we need to hook up an event for the change so we can save it, and then the initial value. Let's start with the initial value. The value is what the dropdown list will select initially, and that's going to be what we had here before. So here in the previous implementation, where we just used jQuery, we set the value to detail screen model, item form, status string. By the way, the item form is just a form object that takes care of all our fields. Here is where it's defined. It's defined in our detail screen model. And if I press F12 on that type, you'll see that the form is nothing but a bunch of strings and numbers. Very simple. Okay, so coming back here, now we're setting the initial status for the dropdown list. What happens when we change it? Well, we can listen for the change event. So in the options, I'm going to specify the change event, and that's going to be a function. I'm going to define it as an arrow function here, and we're going to need to define an event here. So this event has a sender and the value on it. This will give us the new value after the dropdown has been changed. And here is where we want to set this string on the form to the new value. So I'm going to set that like this. And after the form value has been changed, I want to notify the details model so it actually saves to the API. So detail screen model, notify update item. Let's take a brief look at that function. All this does is just look at the form. It gets the updated item from the form and triggers this on item saved function. And all that does is call the detail page model item saved function. Let's take a look at that right here. So here it calls the backlog service, update item, and so on. And then it returns the updated item to our form. So it's the circle of life. I'm going to save this and let's take a look. Okay, so I'm going to reload this just so that we know we're looking at an open item here. And if I change this item to say closed, and then I refresh the page, you can see that our item gets loaded with this status that's closed. Let's go back to the backlog and let's take a look at done items and open up this one right here, the second one. So this should have a status of done. And well, the status is actually called closed, but it is done. So if I switch this to open and it's called open source aggregate channels, let's go back to the backlog, open items, and there it is, open source aggregate channels. Okay. So that is working fine. There are two other drop-down lists here. These are for you to do, but we'll do them together, of course, in the next lesson. But I'd like you to try and do this yourself for the item type and the priority. There's one catch. Let's take a look at the finished product here. If I go to the details page here you'll see that the item type actually has icons in there. And the priority has these bootstrap badges. So make sure you implement that as well. You can use the documentation here. But if you go to this page right here for the demos, you'll actually see a section called customizing templates. This is what you're looking for. You want to have a custom template set up. In this lesson, we're going to apply some templates so that our drop-down lists can look a little bit more user-friendly by having some kind of extra styling for each of the items or even images. While you were gone, I went ahead and added Kendo styling to the title field and the description field. You've already done this in an earlier lesson in this chapter. So if you need to do that, just go ahead and take a look at those. Okay, so we've already implemented the status drop-down list. And I've already started on this priority one because the implementation is pretty much the same as the last lesson. Hopefully you had some luck with the templating by using the documentation, but let's do this together now if you haven't done that yet. In the code, the priority dropdown will look pretty much the same as we had for the status one, where I have the dropdown list options, and then I select the cell priority select and convert that to a Kendo dropdown list. And we're also notifying the model so that it can update the database on changes. Great. So this is working just the same way that statuses was working, but here we want to add a little bit something extra. We want to add a template. So right under the value here, I'm going to add another property called template. And template can be either a string or a function. I'm going to use a function here because I want to have control over the rendering, and I want to call an external function that's a helper function. So let's take care of this together here. I'm going to call this function template DD priority markup. And I don't need to call this function. I just need to specify it here. Now this function will get a parameter, and the parameter will be that object. For each one of the items in this list, it's going to pass that item into this function so we can generate the HTML from it. If it's an object, it'll pass an object. If it's a string, it'll pass a string. In our case, priorities are an enum type, so that's what it'll pass along. Let's go up here, and right above our render screen details function, I'm going to create another function called template DD priority markup, and this will take a parameter of priority enum type, and it'll return a string. So let's create a constant, which will be our markup. I'm going to use the backticks for ES6 string templates, and here I'm going to return a span. And just to make sure it works first, before I do any kind of styling here, I want to go ahead and return that priority that I've passed in. So let's return the markup here, and let's take a look to make sure this works. Okay, so priorities look like they're working fine, even with the template. Now we can do some crazy stuff with the template, whatever we want here. But we have something in mind, and that's using Bootstrap badges. So to this span, I'm going to apply a class. And inside here, I'm going to use the Bootstrap badge class. If I take a look at this now, you'll see that we already have a little bit of badge styling applied here with the smaller, bolder font. But we're not done. We want to apply a color based on the priority. So to the badge class, I'm going to add getIndicator class. And I'm going to fix that import // shared. And let's take a look at that function itself. It takes in a priority enum, and based on whatever priority it receives, it's going to return a matching class. So let's save it and take a look. Okay, great. That's exactly what we want. So now we have a different color for each one of the priorities. All right, if you followed along so far, here's one more chance for you to implement this item type dropdown with images. Let's take a look at the final implementation. This is what it should look like. So for a bug, it has a little bug image, and for a PBI, a star, and so on. If you need some help, remember on the backlog page, we already used these images right here in the leftmost column. So there's already a helper function in the app that does this for us. All right, now let's do this together. I'm going to go to the details screen file and find the drop-down list where we're creating the item types, and that's right here. I'm going to comment this out, and I'm going to paste in the code that's going to render this as a Kendo drop-down list, similar to the way we've done before. We have the data source as item types provider this time. It's also a string array. We have the change event being handled and saving the data. We have the value bound, and we have this template. So we need to create this template function, and that's going to be similar to what we did before. I'm going to go ahead up here and paste in this function that's going to be creating the template for us. So here we're using the PT item type, which I'm going to import. All right, so this function is pretty similar to the priority markup function, except that instead of a span, we're returning an image in a span. and the image has this class backlog icon, which is defined right here, which limits the height of the image to 20 pixels. Let's take a look at that. All right, so there's item type, and our dropdown now has these nice icons. As far as our details form, we've implemented every single field here except for this estimate, which is a slider. Well, Kendo comes with its own slider too, so we can use that. In the documentation, we have this slider right here, and this will give you an idea of how we can implement this slider. In the end, we want it to look something like this. So go ahead and try this out on your own as your final exercise for the details form. Our form is looking pretty good. Let's quickly take a look at another component that we're going to implement, and that's to implement this slider here for the estimate. Right now, we're just using an input that's of type range, and this is just a plain HTML input. But if we look at the completed application, we want it to look like this. This is a slider that's going to give us a little bit better UI and interaction, where we have these buttons. We can press them to change the number that's selected for the estimate. I invited you to do this as an exercise by using the documentation. If you've done so, great. If you haven't, let's do this together now. I'm going to go to the code, and we're also working on the details screen. Let's look at the details HTML, and here is the estimate input. As you can see, it has a step, a min, and a max. So we're going between 0 and 20 here, and we're stepping by 1. We're going to leave this alone. We're not going to touch this. We're going to do all our code here in the details screen. Now, a slider widget is another widget, so we need to go up here to the top, and we need to import it separately. So that's coming from progress, Kendo UI, JS, Kendo slider. Okay, so now let's go to the section of the code where we're actually using the slider and we're saving its value. And that's right here. I'm going to comment this out just like we did for the old drop-down lists, because we're going to convert this to the Kendo slider. I'm going to use this same input. So the jQuery selector is going to be exactly the same. And now I'm just going to use the Kendo slider function on it. And let's take a look at what that did. Great. So now we have the Kendo slider, and this is inheriting the values right from the HTML element. So you can see it's going from 0 to 20 already without having to specify it in the code. That's fine, but if I refresh the page, that value is not being saved, nor is it being set properly initially. So we're almost there. Let's head back to the code and fix this up. Just like the drop-down lists, Kendo slider also accepts options, but we're not going to pass this in directly. We're going to create the options object right here. I'm going to call it estimate options, and I can pass the estimate options into the Kendo slider. Now, what kind of options do we need here? Well, I do want to set the min and the max in code just so that I can control it all in one place. We also have a few other ways to control the look and feel of this. For example, there is the large step value that we can set, and I'm going to set that to 1. And what that does is create this large divider with every single one of the steps, 1 through 20. I can select a small step and set that to 2, but that wouldn't make any sense because the small step is actually smaller than the large step. So usually we would set the small step to a smaller value like 1, and the large step we can set to 5. Let's take a look. So now every 5 numbers, we have a large step, which has a longer dashed line here and a number displayed, and the small step is every 1. We can also control this further by adding some labels to the left and right buttons. For example, decrease button title, we can call this one less, and increase button title, we can call this one more. So if we take a look at the buttons and we hover over them, this one's going to say less, and this one's going to say more. All right, what about functionality? We need to set the value of this, right? So the value is also stored in the form, and the property name is estimate. So I can just copy that right out of the old code that we had here. Let's paste that in. Now when the page reloads, this estimate slider is going to be set to the value that belongs with the object. We also need to listen for the change event. And just like before, we're going to set the value to the form property, and we're going to let the model know that things have been updated to save yourself to the database. Now, when we take a look at this, if I set this to 10, for example, and refresh the page, it stays at 10. If I go to 15, refresh, it stays at 15. That takes care of all our fields for the form, but since we're on the detailed page, let's convert these buttons to tabs. That's part of the requirements. One of our requirements for version 2 of RPS Tracker is to convert the details page to use a tabbed interface. Right now, the details page has these buttons at the top, which switch between the screens on the details page. There's a few things I want you to notice here as we're switching between these screens. Notice the URL here. Right now, it says screen equals details. And if I tap on tasks, screen equals tasks. So we're maintaining the state of our screen position in the URL. So now if I go to screen here and I change this parameter to tasks, I can deep link directly into the task screen of the details page. We want to keep this functionality when we implement our tabs using the Kendo UI TabStrip component. Let's go to the documentation, which has a TabStrip here. The TabStrip is pretty simple to implement. All we have to do is create a container, and then the list inside of the TabStrip will indicate what tabs we're going to have. Following the list, we have the contents for each tab. However many list items we have, that's how many blocks of content we should have, one for each tab. And then we just instantiate the Kendo TabStrip using the jQuery selector for the overall container. Let's look at the final application. This is what our TabStrip ends up looking like. And notice the URL is changing. And if I go to, let's say, tasks directly, you'll see two things. I end up on the tasks screen, but also the tasks tab is selected. I want you to go ahead and try to implement this yourself as an exercise now before we do it together. All right, now that you've had your chance to try this out, hopefully you were successful. But if not, don't worry, we'll do this together now. Let's go to the code. And we're not going to be working with a details screen anymore. We're going to be working with the detail page itself. So I'm going to close this out. Here is the detail HTML. We need to make some changes in here. So I'm going to close these templates here. And let's go over here to where we have the buttons. These are the buttons that we use to switch between the screens. We're going to keep that same structure and we're going to keep these divs the same, but we're going to position them differently inside a TabStrip. So let's sketch out the HTML for now. I'm going to leave this toolbar up here just for now temporarily, and I'm going to close out this div just so we have the title on its own separate row. Now for the TabStrip, I'm going to open up a new div and I'm going to give this div an ID of TabStrip. That probably should be a little more descriptive, but I want to make sure we don't make any mistakes here. So the first part of the TabStrip is an unordered list. This list of items is going to be converted to the tabs. So I have 3 tabs. I need 3 list items: details, tasks, and chit chat. And then the content that's going to correspond to these tabs is going to have their own divs. So I need 3 divs here. And order matters. So the first div must contain the content for the details, the second one must contain the content for the tasks, and the third one for the chit chat. All right, I already have these divs down here. I'm just going to use these. So let's cut and paste this details screen container. I'm going to paste that into the first div. The second is going to be the tasks screen container. I'm going to cut this and paste it into the second tab. And here's the third one for chit chat. I'm just going to drag that one in. Now I'm going to delete all these buttons here. We no longer need those. And it looks like I have an extra div. I'm just going to remove that. This probably doesn't look too good right now. All we have is an unordered list. Well, let's go ahead and convert that to a TabStrip. So we need to open up the code, which is index. And up here at the top, I'm going to import the TabStrip from progress, Kendo UI, JS, Kendo TabStrip. Let's go down here where we initialize the jQuery code. And here's my document ready event. This is where I'm going to select our TabStrip by ID. And I'm going to call the Kendo TabStrip function on it. We also don't need these button switch events because we no longer have those buttons. But I'm not going to delete that yet because we're going to need to use this navigation line later on. All right, so let's take a look at what they did. Well, looks like we have our tabs now, but nothing is selected at the moment. Let's select tasks. Okay, so it looks like it partially works. At least tasks works. Details doesn't seem to work, but what if we go to the details URL and then select details? Okay, now it works, but it's not quite where we want it to be yet. We want to be able to select the current screen based on the URL, and we want to select the proper tab based on that. So let's go to the code and let's go to the HTML. In order to make a tab active, it needs to have a special class. So if I add this class of k-state-active to the details tab, you'll see that the first tab loaded will be the details tab and it'll be the active tab. But how do we assign this dynamically based on whatever tab is selected from the URL? Well, we can't do it like this because this is not going to give us any dynamic control. Let's go to the code for a second and take a look at how we can get the current screen. Our details page model, which is the model behind this code, has a current screen property on it that's already been used and it's already being populated. And here, when we're changing the item, we're actually switching on that type and rendering the correct screen. So we want to use this detail page model current screen to grab the current screen and add that kStateActive class to that list item. We need to be able to select which list item based on the screen. So I'm going to add our own data property here, data tab title. This is not Kendo related. This is just my own, and this will match the screen type. So details, tasks, and finally chit chat. Now we're able to select that based on the attribute called data tab title. So right here, I'm going to use a jQuery selector. Notice I'm using backticks here for templated string. You'll see why in a second. And I'm going to use the attribute selector called data tab title. And I want that to equal to, here's where I need my templated string, detail page model, current screen. So this will select the current screen and the current LI. And we're going to add a class to it. That's the kStateActive class. Let's save everything and take a look. Okay, so we have the details page selected because that's the current screen. If I go to tasks, then we have tasks selected. Chit chat. Okay, great. So we are getting the values passed from the URL down to the TabStrip. But if I select the tasks tab manually, it still doesn't work. So there's one more event we need to handle, and that's the select event. So we can navigate to the tasks screen and set the current screen to the one that we just clicked on. And just like all the other Kendo widgets, the Kendo TabStrip takes in a set of options. I'm going to create the options object separately. I'm going to call it TabStrip options. We're only interested in one, and that's select. This is the event that happens when we tap on one of the tabs. The first thing we want to do is get the item of the event, and we want to get its text content. Its text content is going to have a few spaces around it and some other HTML that we don't need. So we're going to trim the white space just so we can get the detail screen type. We're going to convert this to lowercase. Let's save this off into a selected screen constant. And now we're going to use the same exact navigation function that we did before. That's why I kept this code around. So I'm going to copy this and paste it here. And this is the function that we use to navigate, or we're not actually navigating anywhere. We're just pushing the new URL state with a new screen name into the address bar. Of course, we also need to set the current screen of the detail page model to the newly selected screen. And let's call refresh on the detail page model. Let's take a look at this now. If I tap on tasks, nothing happens. And that's because I forgot to pass in the options that we've just created into the Kendo TabStrip. So I'm going to pass in the Kendo TabStrip options here when we create the Kendo TabStrip. And let's check this out. I'm going to tap on tasks. We navigate to tasks, details, chit chat, and notice the URL is updating as I'm tapping through these tabs. And if I go directly to the tasks in the URL, we go to tasks. Let's make sure that this still works. Task 1, add, and there it is. Comment 1, and let's make sure our title can be updated as well. Perfect. Okay, so that's the TabStrip. Let's go back to the dashboard page next and implement one more component that's very popular, the ComboBox. We've seen a lot of components so far, including inputs, drop-down lists, sliders, tabs, and buttons. Yet there's one more component that's very useful that we're going to look at now, just before we get into the more complex components. And this is the ComboBox. If we take a look at the completed application on the dashboard page, we have this drop-down right here. It's actually a ComboBox, but we can use it to filter the data that's shown below. So I can filter the data by user. And as you can see, the active issues gets updated as well as the chart. And this is a ComboBox because you can not only select it by drop-down, you can also type the values right in here directly. To find the documentation for the ComboBox, you can go to the documentation site. The ComboBox is right here. And it's a very powerful component that allows you to do virtualization, server-side filtering, templating, grouping, and so on. As an exercise, you can go to the existing application and try implementing the combo box for the dashboard. Place it right here next to the existing buttons. All the backend API calls for fetching users is already implemented for you, as well as the front-end code to fetch the data. Go ahead and try this out and come back when you're done, and we'll proceed together now. Let's go to the code, and I'm going to close everything out here. Let's open up the code files, and let's look at the page dashboard folder. We're going to need the combo box, and that's a separate component. So let's go up to the top, and I'm going to import the combo box from progress, Kendo UI JS, Kendo ComboBox. And the way we implement a combo box in HTML is just by using an input. So let's go to the dashboard HTML, and right next to our buttons here, this is a group of buttons. We're going to add another group of buttons right before that. So this is going to be a div, and I'm going to add this class right here to it. This is, by the way, just bootstrap styling, nothing special. And inside of this, I'm going to add an input. So this input is going to serve as our combo box, and it's going to have an ID of input assignee because we're filtering by assignees. And it's going to have a placeholder. We're going to use the text select assignee in here. Let's also give it an inline style with a width of 260 pixels so all the names fit. Right now, if we take a look, you'll see that we have a plain input here with a select assignee, but it's positioned very well according to bootstrap styling, so we don't need to worry about positioning. Now let's convert this to a Kendo combo box. So back to the code, and right down here in the document ready event, I'm going to select our input called input assignee. I'm going to call Kendo combo box on it. In case you're wondering, this also takes an options object. We're going to get into that shortly. But for now, I want you to take a look at this. You see that it renders a combo box, but if we click on this dropdown, you'll see that no data is found. So this is a fully functioning dropdown without any data. All the animation is in place, everything is working. We just need to add some data to it now. Let's set this up. I'm going to create a combo box assignee options object. The most important thing to implement here is the data source. So the data source is going to be an array of objects. These are going to be our users. Now, I don't want to load the users right away when I load my page. That would be wasteful. What if we don't use the combo box? Then I've loaded all those users for nothing. I only want to load the users when I know that I need the combo box. So the combo box provides an event for us to use in this situation, and that's the open event. Whenever we open the combo box or click on the dropdown, that's when we want to request the users. So let's go ahead and implement this open event, and our dashboard page model is going to have this users requested function. We're going to need to do some work on the model here. I'm going to open up this dashboard page model, and right now we don't have a users requested function. So we need to do that. In the last lesson, we've set up the combo box, and now we have it rendered on our dashboard page, but we don't have any data yet. When we open the combo box, it triggers this open event, and we're going to call users requested. So we're going to get the users when the combo box opens up. So let's go to the dashboard page model, and we want to use a couple of classes that are already implemented. One of them is the store. So this is a store implementation similar to the way Redux is implemented, but not exactly. It's not as full-featured. It's just a simple in-memory store implementation. And we also have a user service. So I'm going to create a user service here, which is also implemented. This is going to take in a store. Now, typically, you wouldn't instantiate your repositories and your services in your models. This is something you should inject using dependency injection. But for this demo, we're just creating new instances of these right in here in our model. All right, let's go up here and fix up our imports. Great. So now we have a store and we have a user service. We're going to use the user service to fetch our users. So let's go down here to the bottom, and I'm going to create a public function called users requested. All this will do is just use the user service and call its fetch users method. Notice fetch users doesn't return anything. It doesn't even return a promise. So how are we going to get our users in here? Well, fetch users is going to call the backend API to get all the assignees, all the possible users in the system, and it's going to store them in the store right here. And the store is reactive. It's using RxJS so we can actually listen for changes in the store. And whenever users are updated, we can get those users here in our model. So let's go up here to the top of the model. And right over here, I'm going to create a public property called users. It's going to be users $, to signify that it's an RxJS observable. Where are we going to get these users? Well, we're going to use this.store, and we're going to select part of the store. This is the part of the store that's users. So you can see that we can have a state key here, and we can only select a few of the options here. One of them is users. So let's go ahead and select that. So we can now listen for changes to users. But who is interested in these changes? Well, the function that's going to be rendering our items inside of the combo box is interested. So right over here, we already have a similar pattern that we're following when we're rendering the status counts like this. We're going to do something similar here. So dashboard, page model, users, and we're going to subscribe to any changes that are happening to that user's property. Here we're going to get some users, and we need to set the data source of the combo box to these new users that we're going to get back. So this brings up the question of how do we get a hold of the Kendo UI ComboBox in another function here? We've created the combo box here, but all this does is return us a jQuery element. And a jQuery element is not going to be helpful here because we need the instance of the combo box so we can get to its data source. Well, every Kendo UI widget has this function on it called data. If you call data on the jQuery element, it's going to actually return to you a reference to the widget itself. But we need to pass in the name of the widget. So when we call this function, this will return to us the actual widget, and we need to store it into something. So I'm going to store it into a variable called ComboBox assignee. Let's also not forget to pass in these options here. So I'm going to copy these and pass them into the combo box. Let's create this ComboBox assignee as a variable up at the top here. So right under the dashboard model, we're going to use the let keyword because we're going to be changing it. ComboBox assignee, we're going to initialize it to null, but when this code runs, it's actually going to be saved as the combo box here. So now that we have a hold of the combo box assignee here, when our user's property changes, we can set the combo box assignee and we can set its data source to the users by calling the data property, just like that. Because we have a hold of the combo box here, we can actually set any of its properties, including events, dynamically this way. So if you want to change the behavior of any of the Kendo UI widgets later on, you can do it using this method. But here we need to do a little check because initially users will be blank. So we want to make sure that users exists and combo box assignee has already been assigned so we don't get a null reference exception. And only then we're going to set its data source. Let's take a look. Okay, great. Looks like we are getting some data. It's not looking very nice right now. All we're getting is object in here. But that's because we didn't specify what to look for, what to display. But it looks promising because we are getting some data back. Let's go back to the code. And in the combo box assignee options, we're going to set some more options here. What do we want to use as the display for each of the items? Since this is not an array of strings anymore, these are actual objects, we need to specify the property that we want to use. And we can use data text field to specify what property of the object we want to use for display. Each one of the assignees, or the PT user type, has a full name property. So if I set that, we'll get the names of the people right here in the dropdown. And there's also the value field. So data value field is the ID of each of the users. Great. So far, so good. We're getting these users in here and we're able to select them and clear them out. But as you can see, it's not having any effect on the active issues displayed down below. So there's one more event we need to hook up besides open, and that's the change event. So we need to listen for the change event so we know to update our filter based on the combo box. The change event gets a parameter, so we need to tell the model, which has all our filtering logic, that we've updated the user ID that was selected and to go ahead and refilter the list. And subsequently, we're going to refilter the chart this way too. So let's go to the dashboard page model and let's add a property here that's going to store our currently selected user ID. It's going to be a public property. And we're going to call it selected user ID string. Since user IDs are numbers, we want to specify this as a string because the combo box is going to return to us a string. So when the combo box changes, we want to use that model And we want to set the selected user ID string to the event.sender, and we want to call the value function here to get the actual ID. And now we just need to let the dashboard page model know that the user filter value changed and to do its update. So dashboard page model, user filter value changed. That's not implemented just yet. So let's go back here to the model and go down below. And let's implement this function. It's a public function called user filter value change. So here we're going to set the filter and we're going to get its value. And we want to update the user ID, this selected user ID string, which is not going to work because user ID is a number and here we have a string. So we want to go ahead and use the number constructor to convert this to a number. And then we want to call refresh to get all the latest data based on the current filter. However, this only takes care of part of the cases. This only takes care of the case where a new user ID is selected. But our combo box actually allows us to clear a user. So let's say we've selected a user, we've filtered the active issues, but now we want to clear the user and only take dates into account for the filter. When we clear the user, the selected user ID string will be undefined. So we want to make sure we take care of that case also and reset the filter. So if this dot selected user ID string, then I'm going to implement this code. Otherwise, we're going to set the user ID of the filter back to undefined. And now we can filter by the dates and we can also filter by the users. When we clear the user, only the dates are taken into account for the filter. Great. So this is working. We can leave this as is. But according to our requirements, there's one more thing we need to do, and that's to show the lovely faces of these people. We're going to implement templates. We have a functioning combo box with the names being selected based on the user objects, but we also want to show the avatars for each of the users, and we're going to use templates to do this. Now, I've kept this other demo page open for a reason, and this one has documentation on the combo box. And specifically, we're looking for customizing templates right here. So this is pretty similar to what we want to implement for our combo box as well. And if we take a look down here, the combo box supports several different types of templates. It has a capacity to support a footer, a header, and then this is what we're actually trying to implement. This is just the standard template for each of the items. Now the template can also take in a function just like we did before for our drop-down lists in the previous lessons. But we don't have a need for that in this case. We can use this special templating syntax to specify a template right in line. Let me show you this templating syntax in action now. So we're going to go back to the code and let's go to our combo box assignee options. And right over here is one of the options we can specify a template. So as you can see, you can take in a string or a function. Here we're going to specify a template string by using these backticks. And I'm going to paste in the code, which is just HTML markup. So this is going to be a div styled with Bootstrap with some margin on it. And we're going to have an image and a span. They all have their own individual styling as well. But notice over here, we have something special. We have this Kendo UI templating syntax. So for the source of the image, we have a hash sign and then equals. And then we have avatar and a hash sign that closes the template syntax. Same thing with full name. We have a span here, a hash equals to open the binding, and then another hash to close the binding. So the template that you're providing here is a template for each of the items. So each of the objects in your array that you're iterating over becomes the context for the template. Since our context for the template is one PT user, we can use its properties directly in the template and bind directly to them. So avatar is a property on the PT user. That's the URL of the image. And the full name is also a property of the user. I'm going to save this and let's take a look. And there we go. Each one of our assignees now has the avatar and the name next to each other. And our filtering still works. Now, you're probably curious to find out more about this templating syntax, as it is very special to Kendo UI. So there is a section in the documentation I'd like you to take a look at. If you go to the documentation and scroll down a little bit to utilities, and here you can see the template section, overview. This is a good section for you to take a look at if you want to be using Kendo templates. There are benefits to using these templates because it's going to increase performance. Instead of calling functions every time you want to render a template, this is an inline template that's going to be better for performance. So here is an example of the hashes that I was talking about. And this goes into a lot more detail than I'm able to now. But this will give you an introduction to templates. You can use these templates with the ComboBox. You can use these templates with the drop-down list that we saw earlier. And a lot of these components use templates. We'll come back to templates later on when we're talking about the grid.